My name is David Brown. I have been doing YouTube videos for a while now, not very regularly, and this time I'm going to do something a bit different. Usually I talk about toys or movies. This will be about history, kind of. I'm going to be talking about the Landkreuzer or Rat project, which is shown in the most common representation here. It supposedly was an attempt in World War II to make a tank or something like a tank that would be 1,000 tons. And I will be talking about whether the whole concept here is something that could really be built. Now, the main thing to really talk about here is I may be doing stuff on my phone while I talk. That this is something where there's going to be dispute whether this was ever even a serious project. The supposed backstory is that Hitler had his generals and his designers investigate whether they could build a tank or some kind of land vehicle in the 1,000-ton range. That is relatively substantiated. Then there's a theory that they also considered building a land vehicle with battleship turrets from ships that had been either decommissioned or never finished. Now that might also be true. What it's been increasingly recognized is that anything beyond that, especially in terms of designs, it's not necessarily confirmed that it's authentic, and there's a lot of question if these were really serious proposals. Now, what I'm really going to be talking about here is what you would actually get building anything remotely like this. And my real authority here, I used to write a series called Exotroopers, where I dealt with existing vehicles. Part of the idea for the whole series is that most of the technology would be obsolete now, and I dealt with speculative stuff, and that included very large vehicles. I'll get to that. And I also, very early on, got interested in a series called Bolos. It started out as a series of stories in the 60s. Then they did a much larger series in the 90s mainly. And I was collecting these when they were coming out. The kind of funny thing, in the original stories, the whole idea is that there's giant tanks that have actual AI that have to be decommissioned so they don't hurt anyone. So the whole point of the original stories was that these things are dangerous. Then in the series they did in the 90s, the whole point was these things are awesome. Yes. So this is probably the most developed version of the giant tank concept in fiction. These are the first two books here. Pardon me, this is book 7. I was mistaking the 7 for 1. Oh no, this is book 1. Yes, this is going to be one take. You can see here, this is done actually as a semi-sensible tank, except for size. You see smaller vehicles. Here it's more dramatic. It's just the one tank in lava, which does represent something from one of the stories in the book. Now, the thing about this whole concept is that the tank is really just one variation of the armored vehicle, and it's intended for what you would call linear warfare. The whole idea of linear warfare is you have forces who can see each other, and a corollary of that is that the weapons are primarily direct fire. Also, it's because of that you have tanks that have very heavy armor. And that is going to be a very important thing. Now, what's never been really discussed is that there are alternatives to the tank, especially when you have a large vehicle with a much larger gun. The obvious thing is what they call self-propelled artillery. And this was something where the line moved. In World War II, they really started with very small guns, and this was in fitting with linear warfare, and especially tanks whose primary purpose was dealing with infantry, not other tanks. So you would have 20 millimeter guns, sometimes just machine guns. You would have 37 millimeter, maybe 57 millimeter, what they called the 6-pounder. Well, 37 was 2-pounder, 57 was 6-pounder. And they really had no reason to expect that they would need guns bigger than that wouldn't be going into the self-propelled artillery category. And when you have self-propelled guns, they tend to do one of two things. Either they are lightly armored or even not armored at all, and that's one more thing I'll be coming back to. Or in some cases, they would keep the armor but remove having a turret. So the whole thing with that style of gun was, for one thing, you would build the vehicle around the gun as much as vice versa. And you didn't worry about pointing in different directions because you only need to point the gun in one direction, and if that's not the case, somebody already screwed up. If the enemy's behind you and you're shooting your artillery, yeah, that is not something that happens in normal operations unless your operation is failing. So if you have these big guns at the rear of your lines and no one else is at the rear of your lines, you don't need anything else. So, of course, as they build bigger tanks with heavier armor, then the tank-on-tank engagements really became a thing, and that was when you also had bigger guns. So you were putting on 75 millimeter, 76.2, the 88, and it's really noteworthy, even in World War II, they were still not going to really large guns. You had the self-propelled guns and tank destroyers that had big guns like 100 millimeter, 120, 128, but those were not tanks. It was only the IS tanks, especially the IS-3, that had guns of over 100 millimeter. And the funny thing is, in the post-war period, the immediate reaction was actually to scale the guns back, or at least go to a middle ground. So you would have tanks with 90 or 105 millimeter. And you didn't really start going back up until the late Cold War, with things like the Abrams, and the one really groundbreaking experiment as far as going beyond the limits was the Sheridan. That was a light tank that had an incredibly huge gun. It was 152 millimeter. And the thing about that, it was very much stretching, however you look at it, the limits of what a real tank, something that was really a tank, could actually handle, especially something that was a light tank. It wasn't supposed to have the power of a full artillery. The original concept was actually a gun-launched missile, which would be a completely different thing. But they did try building standard ammo, and usually for anti-personnel or demolition stuff, and it would just beat the hell out of the tank. It was so light it could not handle the recoil of a gun that big, and it probably would be about the same if you had even a heavier tank. So that was the upper limit of what you could do, or what anyone considered doing with a vehicle you could still consider a regular tank. Now, the corollary to that, of course, is that there are 150 or 155 millimeter self-propelled guns from World War II on, but again, those are not the same thing as a tank, and that shows especially in their role. Now, here is my contribution to the concept of super heavy tanks. It's from my exotroopers series. I call this Omega Aleph. And to give a context here, it's from an exotroopers series where they fight aliens, as in the Alien franchise. So this huge, by my intention, absurdly huge thing exists in part to house an alien queen. And if that sounds like a joke, here is my sketch of the alien queen, my version of the alien queen, and an exotrooper fighting an alien, which is just to say, by my own admission, this was never supposed to be a series that was realistic. So with this, it's supposed to be about 300 feet long, 100 meters, and about 5 stories tall. And my nominal weight for this thing was 10,000 tons. And the funny thing is, I ended up doing this so it mostly made sense. So to start with, it's supposed to be behind the lines, and most of what it has is to defend itself. These are supposed to be missile launchers for shooting down aircraft or other incoming missiles. There was supposed to be a pad to launch helicopters. That might sound like the terrestrial aircraft carrier concept. This really wasn't supposed to be like that. I just pictured it having 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 helicopters below decks that they could launch to carry personnel or supplies for this thing. And really part of that is that this thing is so huge, it would be hard to supply by regular trucks or ground vehicles, because wherever they were, you'd have to get the things back up. Now, I also have just an anti-aircraft gun here, and I had a missile launcher right about here. So this, I would say, really is the closest you can get to a sane concept for a very large tank, or a tank-like vehicle, and a big part of what I really based on was the Beggar 288. And here's one of my other sketches, showing it from the front. You can see some of the radar. It has an actual conning tower, radar, anti-aircraft guns. This is it being fired on by other vehicles. And this, I really couldn't avoid doing, is it running over another vehicle. So, what you really see with this kind of vehicle is that you have something that's not a tank, but more like a mobile fortress or even a mobile airbase. And one thing you have to give some credit for, the Bolos series, both in the original series and the anthologies from the 90s, did deal with this. They showed the Bolos still acting like tanks where they're being shot at on the ground and shooting back and having armor that can absorb very heavy weapons fire. But that's shown with various degrees of explicitness to be just one of the things they can do. They also have guns that can shoot at aircraft, guns that can even shoot at things in orbit, which is what you would be dealing with something like this outside of just the World War II setting. So if you did have something like this, the thing nobody really talks about is that you're no longer going to be that worried about armor. And that brings me to something that's still getting overlooked. This is the closest thing to a real-life Landkreuzer. It's called the Karl. They really did call it Karl, apparently after a real guy. This is the biggest thing used in battle that you can say was both a self-propelled vehicle and used in proper combat. Now, it gets overshadowed by the mouse. And the thing about the mouse, that was taking the true tank concept to its limits. And the obvious problem was that it was way too heavy. It weighed almost 200 tons. The other thing was it still had something pretty close to a regular-sized tank gun. And that really limited to acting like a tank. And this, on the other hand, is very much a self-propelled gun. To give scale, it's 40, maybe 50 feet long. I'd really have to look that up. And I did confirm it weighed just under 140 tons. It's American, or what they call short tons, but still, this thing was enormous. Metric tons comes out at more like 120. I think the figure given is 124, and that really probably would have varied by what it was carrying and what it was doing. And the gun on these things, they did build multiple ones, was 60 centimeter. And to give other scale, an American foot is about 30 centimeters. So this thing had a 2-foot bore. And what it was intended for was demolishing the Maginot Line. So this was obviously designed pre-war, right at the beginning of the war. And it was designed for a rational function. So the obvious thing that went wrong was that the war made the purpose obsolete before it could really have been brought out to use. Really, probably it wouldn't have even taken something this big to defeat the Maginot Line for real, but we can leave that out. So what the Germans ended up with was this huge gun, and trying to figure out something they could do with it without dealing with the problems it had. Now, the obvious thing is it has absolutely no armor. There's sort of a cab in here. Now, I will say also, you may have, if you have seen or know of this at all, have seen it in Girls und Panzer. For me, it was the other way. I first found out that Girls und Panzer existed when I was looking up stuff on this thing and found the videos from Girls und Panzer. So at any rate, apart from a crew cabin, which probably would have only the most minimal armament, it's wide open. And overall, if you were doing a balanced vehicle, you would have something, even if it was just enough to stop machine gun fire or rifle fire, maybe very light aircraft fire. But again, if you're dealing with more than that, again, something like this, it's not the vehicle's problem. It's your problem because you let the enemy get close to it when it's not meant to be even really within sight of an enemy. To give ideas, this thing had a range of multiple miles, and there were two versions of the gun. Another was only 54 centimeters, and the range was about 5 or 6 up to 10 miles. So with this thing, relatively it's still kind of medium range if you're factoring in things like missiles, which of course they were just beginning to develop at that point. But for anything else, this is very extreme range. You certainly would not have this thing duking it out with tanks. The only way you really would get that would be if you're trying to take out a whole tank formation. And there is a story about that. There was one more thing the Nazis built called the Sturmmorser. It was just a Tiger tank chassis with that giant 38 centimeter gun. But that was pretty much a random event, and they probably were only doing that because the Sturmmorser and the Karl were both intended for demolition, and the Sturmmorser was enough like a tank that it could actually be used as a more combat role because it had armor and it was still the size of a tank, not like this thing. So what they actually did, they used it against fortifications in Russia, in Crimea, that had been built by the Turks in the 19th century, and they used it to demolish chunks of Warsaw, though that you can hardly even count as combat. They were just leveling the city just because. There's stories that Hitler also planned to use this to demolish Paris, but they couldn't get there in time because this thing was so big. It could go at very low speeds, maybe 5 miles an hour on completely level ground, and its range was pretty limited, probably not much more than it could shoot with the gun. And again, that was not unreasonable for its original intended function. If you're in Germany shooting at France, you're not dealing with wilderness, and you're especially not dealing with hostile ground forces. So they just had these things they would move around once in a while, use once in a while, and again, it was just something that was designed for a mission that no longer applied by the end or even the middle of the war. So there is a question, was this a practical vehicle? Up to a point, the answer is yes. And it does show what you're really dealing with for the parameters of a vehicle more than 2 times the size of a normal tank, or 2 or more times the size of a normal tank. So definitely anything over 100 tons. You don't have a turret, or you don't necessarily need the turret. You don't need a lot of armor, and you really don't even need for it to be that fast. And what they really needed to make this a completely functional weapon were technologies that really wouldn't have existed at that point. The most actually apocalyptic thing you could load into a gun this big would be a thermobaric or fuel-air shell. I know those things aren't quite the same, but you can use them a little bit interchangeably. Yes, that's where you fill the air with fuel, napalm, something combustible, and then light the air on fire. In World War II, they were starting to work out the theory of how those things worked. A lot of it was as an accidental byproduct of some of the fire bombings. So they might have had the technology, but they didn't have the theory to apply it in that way. If you had something this big as a thermobaric weapon, it would be hundreds of meters, if not multiple kilometers. That you could take out a good chunk of an army or deny an entire area to the enemy, since one of the things the fuel air bombs do, or thermobaric, is suck away all the oxygen. The other thing that would have made it useful, beyond the demolition roll, would have been submunitions. Now, this is something I haven't worked it all out, but most of the development on that line was in the Cold War, especially the late Cold War. That's when you got first airdrop bombs, then rockets and regular artillery shells that could split up into submunitions, and those would come down and either blow up on their own or, and this is what got them notorious, actually arm themselves as landmines. And scatterable mines definitely would have been pushing things with World War II technology. Still, this would have been a suitable platform for something like that if any of them had survived the war, or if the war had somehow gone on long enough for things like that start to become available. Though, of course, that's going even beyond regular alternate history into whole scenarios, or what they call alien space bats. Probably not quite on that level, but getting close. Now, here's a few more things to show. And this is from a 1980s toy line called Megaforce. And here you can really see what an evolution of something like the Karl might have looked like. You've got a large vehicle. This is supposed to be something like a regular tank that comes out of the front of it. And it's really not even that big. It's maybe 2 or 3 times as long as the tank. And it's launching this thing in the material that went with it. It's described as launching either submunitions or I think it also talked about an incendiary warhead, but mostly submunitions. And what you're dealing with really is a mobile intercontinental or other ballistic missile launcher. And what we did learn through the course of the Cold War is that you didn't really need something this big. The Soviets could do that, and we probably did it too, by loading things onto a trailer that could be pulled by an 8x8 truck. They were very big vehicles, but they were not tanks or other tracked vehicles. And this is supposed to be a launcher for an aircraft. Now, this is obviously pushing it a lot more. Though, if you just make it this or this part here, I can take it off, but I'm not remembering how right now. You'd have something more sensible. And this is most interesting. It's close to Omega Aleph. Just this big slug. Again, this is supposed to be on the same scale. And they actually made this look like a terrestrial aircraft carrier, only the way it launches the aircraft is that you press a button and the whole thing splits open for this platform. Obviously, this would not work, but if you took this and just had it landing on top of this, you could plausibly put something somewhere in here that would support the plane or even hold another plane. And even here also, it's not really like an aircraft carrier, just enough to hold maybe 1 to 3 planes. And you've also gotten guns here, but they are mostly for self-defense by the proportions. So if you had an enemy break through, you could shoot back at them while you were running away, or while other forces were coming to repel the enemy. There's the springy thing again. And now that brings us to the Landkreuzer. I did check, it is Kreuzer. It might also be pronounced Kreutzer, but Kreuzer is common. That's Kreuzer. So the obvious thing with that is that it was an armored vehicle. And that is not something that would work. Really, what we've worked out, and I've seen specifically potential history talk about this, the 1,000-ton figure would have been very low for this. They've calculated that if it weighed 1,000 tons, just the turret and the guns, they'll mention it was 2 guns, not 3, would have weighed half, if not more than half, of the entire weight of the vehicle. And that is just not something that would work. Another thing, it had 28 centimeter guns, which were definitely based on battleships. That is really something where if you're on land, you are going to be shooting outside any direct fire range. And that actually makes it a little more sensible. So One more thing to come out of this, they talk about an even larger proposal that was for a 1,500-ton vehicle. And some of the representations of this will show something not like a tank, but more like what they actually had with the Karl. And what gets opposed a lot of the time is that it would be simply a self-propelled version of the Gustav gun, or sometimes it was called the Karl Garrett. That was an 80 centimeter or 800 millimeter railway gun. And this is something else where you get into a problem with the figures. What this thing actually weighed was about 1,350 tons. I don't recall offhand if that's metric or the short tons, but either way, this is already very close to the figure that's given. And again, if you really built this into a self-propelled vehicle, it would be functioning like the Karl, which is the part that makes sense. The real problem was they were already at the limit of what was practical as a gun. When they did fire it, again, mainly at the fortifications in the Crimean Peninsula, they actually fired enough shells that the gun barrels were considered at the end of their life. And even at that point, there really weren't enough resources to replace them, though there are reports that there was an investigation of putting a smaller caliber, longer barreled gun like they did with the Karl. So if you did turn this thing into a self-propelled platform, it's hard to say how much it would weigh. But here's another thing. They did use the 28 centimeter guns in a railway gun. That was things like what they call Anzio Annie, which did have a significant role, at least in one theater of the war, and that weighed about 400 tons from what I've looked up. Pardon me, it might have been 200, but in that range. So when even an unpropelled gun weighs anywhere between 200 and over 1,000 tons, this is going to be a problem. So what makes sense is you just take the railway gun and you really might simply strip the chassis of the Karl guns and use those as your track units for the self-propelled railway guns, especially after the bombings were so heavy that you didn't really have rail lines left. That was what really paralyzed the Karl. They just couldn't move it around because their railways kept getting bombed. So if you took one of these stripped down, ballpark, I would say 100 tons per track unit. And if you started with something like Anzio Annie, that you could work with. Take 100 tons per track unit, put maybe 2 track units, one front, one back. That I believe would come out as 400 to 500 tons. That was where I was thinking of that figure, so that you could work with. For something like the Gustav gun, that had 4 sets of wheels, which would have been the size of cargo cars for the railway. That, in theory, you might get 4 of these to put with the gun, and they would be replacing some of the weight that was already there, but there's still really no way you can get the weight of something like that under 2,000 tons. And that, again, is assuming a design for a gun that has no significant armor and also doesn't really carry its own shells. That was one more weakness of the Karl. To load the gun, you use the crane, which you can see here, and the crane was loading shells off of modified Panzer IVs. So you'd have 2 or 3 tanks or tank chassis going behind one of these carrying the ammo, and that's where, if you were as far away as Russia, it just stops working. If you've got partisans, even if they don't attack your big gun, they can attack the tanks or ammo carriers carrying tanks, or if they don't do that, they can attack the vehicles that are carrying the fuel for the ammo carriers, or they can always attack your railway tracks that are carrying this whole damn thing. Yeah. So, what would make sense would be to develop a self-propelled railgun as a larger version of the Karl, and especially as a replacement for things like Anzio Annie to use after your railways are bombed out of existence. It wouldn't be a complete solution, but it would be a partial solution. Like, even if you still have to carry it on railway cars most of the way, if you reach a section of track that's a smoking crater, all you have to do is dismount the track vehicle or assemble it and have it go across or go around and get back on the railways. Though you'd still have to deal with either moving the cars or bringing up more cars. And that also is something where you'd have a suitable range. If you were on the Western Front trying to destroy bridges, which was the last thing they tried to use the Karl for, you could engage at well over 10 miles if you had the 28 centimeter gun, or even the lighter version of the Karl. That would go a long ways. So on the Eastern Front, you could probably do something. If you had the location of entire tank or infantry formation, just launch 1 or 2 shells like they would do with the naval bombardments, and at least disperse the formation. And really what they probably would have been doing most often was scorched earth actions, which was what they did in Warsaw and what they wanted to do in Paris. Just destroy the city you conquered or your own cities when you're dealing with the offensives into Germany or the core allied countries like Italy, Austria, and Hungary, and just wipe it off the map. And again, that was where they really didn't quite have what would really do the job, especially when it came to incendiary or actual thermobaric or fuel-air weapons. Really, I could almost picture something like the Bat Bomb Project. Now, if you're not familiar with that, there was an actual project. You might have just heard it as an urban legend, where the United States military investigated using bats to carry bombs, and they got far enough to come up with schematics for a bomb hole that would hold a whole bunch of bats that all had a napalm bomb attached to them. So obviously you would not try to do that. Not the part where you have actual living things. Apart from anything else, if you're also firing it from a gun, that's probably just going to kill the bats. But if you do have the incendiary charges, and that really was something where even there, the Germans might not have been quite up to it in the time and with the resources they really had during the war. You could get dozens, even into the low hundreds, in a 28 centimeter shell, or especially something like a Karl or Gustav gun shell. So with that, you could certainly cover a large infantry or armor formation, or you could definitely do a whole lot of damage to a city. So that would be the kind of thing that something like the Landkreuzer could have been used for. And again, what you'd really be looking at is something much more stripped down. So again, no armor, limited amount of ammunition. You might have some anti-aircraft armament on it, but even for that, the simplest thing is just have a few of the flak panzers following around, the same way you already had the converted panzer armored carriers following it around. And that's one more limitation on the concept. If you have one gun, all you have to do is build a vehicle that will carry that gun. If you're talking about defending the vehicle beyond maybe having a few machine guns on the railings and decks, you're really complicating a design that needs to not be complicated. So again, what you would do is have this thing at the center, or especially at the rear of a much larger group. And that, if someone had developed it then, or even if they developed it now, would still be a credible threat. What you'd really need to do, and I worked this in with Omega Aleph here, would be to hack the GPS satellites. Either black out the entire area, or find a way to put in outdated data, so if they're looking for your vehicle on something like Google Earth, if that's even still a thing, they don't talk about it like they used to, they would just see the old data. They would not see your vehicle. Something like that could probably be done. It's probably already being done up to a point by military forces as far as what's available to their own people in their own country, but it would certainly be difficult. So those are my thoughts on this whole proposal. I'm really still debating whether to put this take up or not, but it is something new. For now, I'm going to sign out, and I'll definitely be looking at following up on this. I'll just see especially what feedback I get.